Hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth Ward and I am with the Sierra Club. In case you don't know what that is, we are a national grassroots environmental organization that works to protect the wild places and access to safe drinking water and clean air for everyone. And I am with the statewide branch. And as I talk tonight, I'm going to talk a lot about information that's helpful to landowners and things like easements. And you might be thinking, what the heck does Sierra Club know about this stuff? And so I am just here representing, I've had the pleasure there we go. I've had the pleasure of working with a ton of different groups and people across the state, so a lot of what I'm sharing is just information that I've been taught by them, and that's why I'm covering a lot of different things. So Sierra Club is part of a coalition called the People Over Pipelines Coalition, and all of these groups and about a dozen others have come together to stop a potential tar sands pipeline down that runs north-south through Wisconsin. And so we are excited and eager that now we can come up and help and add stop it decommissioning line 5 to our goals. So I'm talking about a lot of different things, and I will, but I'll talk a lot about wheat. And so I want to name that now because I'll probably accidentally use the acronym, but I'll go into what it is in depth in a little bit. But WEAT is the Wisconsin Easement Action Team. This is an alliance of landowners along the Line 61 corridor, which is the pipeline that runs north-south through Wisconsin. And the landowners have teamed up together to hire an attorney, and one of the best attorneys in the world for this. His name's Brian Jordy. He's actually the attorney for the Keystone XL landowners in Nebraska as well. And they have hired him to give them advice and to negotiate on their behalf. I'll get into the details in a little bit. But as I talk about it, a lot of this information comes from him and the work we've done in supporting wheat. But before I get there, who's heard of the Keystone Pipeline? Yeah, figured. And when was the Keystone supposed to go in? Anybody know? 2008, or 2007, you're close. So 2008 was the expected operation date. In case you're unfamiliar, it is still not even got all its permits, nonetheless, in the ground and running. Who's heard of the Sandpiper project? Yeah, this is a Bakken pipeline that was supposed to run from North Dakota to Superior. That was supposed to go into operation in 2016. It's completely off the table now. Line 3 replacement project. That is a project that is still on the table, unfortunately, that runs from the Alberta region to Superior. That was supposed to be in operation last year. Still not even got all its permits, and some pretty steep legal trouble right now, and still needs its federal permits. And then the Line 61 pipeline, the twin that I was just talking about that we've mostly been focused on, was supposed to be in operation in 2017. They still haven't even applied for permits. And the reason I am telling you all of this is because Enbridge is going to come in and say, we're in charge here, you have no choice, you have to give us our permits, you have to give us your land, you have no choice, we're in charge. But the reality is we're in charge, and we have shown that over and over and over again, and that's been shown across the country since, this is actually an outdated map, so, but by 2015, over 28 proposed pipelines had already been stopped. And that, and they all play the same games and tell you they're in charge, but that's because that's not true. In every single one, the key was public opposition and delaying the pipeline. So that's what we can do here. And we have it even easier here because this region has such a history of stopping big corporate polluters like GTAC and hog CAFOs. So we can use the lesson, we can use the lesson learned there with those fights as well as these fights around the country to figure out what we can do to make sure that this pipeline, the reroute never gets built and that it's properly decommissioned. So quickly, I mean, these are all of very high level what Enbridge would need for a reroute. So they'll need land in order to put the pipeline through there. They'll need permits from the DNR. They'll need approval by the Public Service Commission. They'll need permits from the local governments and potentially land from them, and they'll need federal permits, but I'm really going to focus on just the land they need. So when negotiating with Enbridge, I saw this sign. I found this online, but it's from some of the landowners in Michigan trying to negotiate with Enbridge. And one of the big things, if Enbridge has approached you, they can be really aggressive. We've already heard they're knocking on people's doors every single day. And so it can be really scary. And so I'm hoping to give some tips and talk through some things to consider when signing the easement, or if you're going to sign an easement or stopping, not signing an easement. And as I go through this, I want to make it very clear, and I hope to remember to say this over and over again, that I am not a lawyer. So this is all information I've learned. I can't give legal advice. I can mostly just scare you and make you consider thinking about things. But I'm not a lawyer. I recommend you all get one though. But one thing we hear from landowners in Wisconsin all the time, and I've heard this from multiple landowners, is that Enbridge is like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They're really nice to you when you're cooperating with them, and then the second you say, I'm not sure I want to sign that, or I'm not sure I want you to tear down those trees, they're really, they can get really dirty, they can get angry, they can be pretty aggressive, so watch out for that. And we have somebody who works with us who somehow got on the list of the company that Enbridge hires to train their land agents. And they tell their land agents, they teach them exactly how to do this stuff, how to come in really sweet and turn to bad cop when it's time. They tell you how to pick out the low-hanging fruit. They tell you to start with the widows. They, according to them, are the easiest to go after, and sort of slowly build up and isolate landowners and divide and conquer them so that they feel like they're the only ones and they have to sign. And we actually work with somebody on the Line 61 corridor who, when they approached her for an easement, they knocked on the door and they came in, and her husband had Parkinson's, and it was pretty clear, and she said she saw the second he walked in the room and they saw that their eyes glistened, like they thought, this is going to be it, this is going to be so easy. They were wrong, luckily, very wrong, but that's the kind of thing that they do. So if you've been approached by Enbridge and asked to sign an easement, and you're considering signing one, the first thing I would say is get a lawyer, but definitely consider kind of the impacts of signing an easement. And we have on the table out there 25 or a list of things to consider when signing an easement. If you've been approached, I highly recommend you pick it up, and please come talk to me, or I don't know if Phyllis is in here. Phyllis in the back is with Wisconsin Safe Energy Alliance, and she can help as well. But I just want to point out a couple of things that you might not even think about to sort of give you an idea of what things to consider if Enbridge has approached you, and it kind of demonstrates how the kinds of games they play. So they're going to approach you and probably have a very basic easement that looks like, oh, this isn't so bad. They are looking for, they just want to take this number of feet and they're going to give me this much money and they're going to put this pipeline through it. But as most things, the devil's always in the details, and without certain things spelled out, and most easements, including most of the easements here in Wisconsin that people have signed with, Lakehead was what Enbridge was called before they became Enbridge, should have all of these glaring errors that give Enbridge a huge advantage that you, as a normal person who doesn't think the world's out to get you, you wouldn't even consider the possibilities, but there are things in there. And a few of these things include who will pay for damage to my land and how will it be addressed. A lot of that is not in there. It might say Enbridge will clean up anything they're responsible for, but what it doesn't say is Enbridge and all the third-party contractors they hire. So Enbridge, most of the work they do actually on the ground is through contractors. And there have been cases with pipeline companies where they say, well, that wasn't our fault. That you have to talk to this company we hired that you never hired. You don't know how to work with. And there's this battle over who's paying for a repair. And as probably everybody knows here, if you've tried to get out of a phone bill or challenge a cable bill or something, bureaucracy takes a really long time. So if you're sitting there fighting with everybody, it can be really challenging, and it's something is no fault of your own at all. Another just example is how many pipelines they're going to put through. That's very rarely spelled out in an easement. The landowners on the corridor through Wisconsin, they signed an easement and thought there was going to be one pipeline in there in 1968. They thought it'd be a relatively small pipeline. 50 years or however many later, they now have 4 pipelines and Enbridge wants to put a 5th in there. Enbridge never had to go back to them and get their sign off. They never had to ask their permission. They said, you gave us this land 50 years ago, it's ours, we can do what we want. So that needs to be clear, specified, and just the fact that they want to put a pipeline. There's nothing, unless it's explicitly written in there, that says they can't decide later. They want to put an easement on there and allow a transmission line to go through, or a rail corridor, or whatever the heck they want. If they have rights to your land, if there isn't very clear things in there about what they can do, they could do a lot with it. There's, like I said, pick this up. One last thing I want to talk about too is liability. And so this, I think, maybe came up and was one of the threats with Enbridge offered as well, is what happens if something happens on the line. So an example of Brian Jordy, the attorney for wheat, that he often gives is most of it's farmland that he works with in Nebraska. One of his clients, their grandson was sitting there tilling and accidentally struck the line. And not Enbridge, the company that owned that line tried to claim you're responsible for what happened. It could have costed millions and millions of dollars, which of course they had no idea. They didn't know there was a pipeline there. The pipeline should have been much further down, that it wouldn't have gotten hit, but because the pipelines tend to rise over time, it was struck. Without something clear in your easement, even if it's 50 years later, even if it's 75 years later, or 100 years later, if there's nothing that specifies anything in your easement, you or your family could be liable. So that is just a few examples of things, and there's again more in here. But if there's one message you get from me, it's that I'm not a lawyer, but you should get one. And so that's what I want to make really clear. These are the things lawyers are trained to look for that average people don't look for, especially when Enbridge is knocking on your door every day. A few other things: don't sign a single thing without a lawyer, or at least reading it really carefully. This includes surveying. Some of you have probably already signed surveying contracts, but if you can't, we hear lots of stories of people who were told that the Enbridge would just be surveying and didn't realize that in the details it gave Enbridge right to do whatever they needed to survey, which included cutting down their trees. It includes coming on their property whenever they want, allowing third parties to come on their property and do what they need. So you have to be really, really careful. And then if you find something, you're negotiating with Enbridge, make them get in writing whatever they promise. So if you say, you can come in and survey as long as you don't cut down any trees, and they say, okay, say, write it down, sign it, because we hear all sorts of stories. Enbridge promised to replant the trees after they were done surveying or not cut something down. What happened is that land agent made the promise. Then they got sent somewhere else. A new land agent is in town and said, I have no idea, that must have been somebody else who promised that. That wasn't me. And nothing that they were promised, whether it was money, whether it was the way that they would do surveying, whether it was how they would fix, what they took down as they constructed the pipeline, none of those promises were kept, and they all just pointed the finger and said, that was the guy before me, I don't know anything, I don't know where he is now. So every single thing, get it and write it. Talk to your neighbors. Enbridge's game is to divide and conquer. They are going to say, they're going to make you feel like you have to sign and you're the only one. Your neighbors will be angry with you if you don't sign. We work with somebody who was told, you are the very last person to sign. That means you are costing us $1 million a day by not signing. If you don't sign this today, we're going to sue you for that $1 million a day. And he had a lawyer, he paid $10,000 for a lawyer who said, wow, this is really scary, you should just sign this. Yeah. That won't work if you say, that's not true, I talked to Mary, she hasn't signed, that's not true, Bob said he's not going to sign either. They aren't going to be able to divide and conquer the way they want to if you're talking to each other, if you know what's happening. And even if you want if you want an easement, if you say, I'm okay with this and I need the money or whatever it is, still talk to your neighbors. It's still good to know you're going to be stronger while you negotiate. And it's still good to know what's happening and what's being said. As part of that, like I said, they go after who they view as the lowest hanging fruit first, which they, according to them, is widows. They go after that and they slowly make their rounds. If you're talking to each other, you'll know what's happening, you'll know what to expect, and they won't be able to tell you something that's not true. For those of you who want an easement or have settled with it over time, that I would recommend that you still kind of hold out. You hear more and more stories that the longer you hold out, the higher it goes. It sounds counterintuitive at first because you think the first person to sign is going to be their favorite and then they're going to give you more money. But if you think about it, the more you hold out, the more desperate they're going to get, the more they're going to offer. And if you think about this collectively, the more if they're desperate because a whole group of people is holding out, the price is going to rise. I have no idea, but I have a feeling that probably the price tag they told Chairman Wiggins went up and up the longer they got more and more desperate and the more they wanted him to sign. And then Enbridge will threaten eminent domain, which I'll mention, I'll talk through in a second, but just don't be afraid of eminent domain court. This is something that one of the landowners we work with who went through eminent domain on a transmission line says. It'll sound really scary. They'll say you're going to end up getting $15 for your land. But just do your research and don't let that shut down the conversation. Just know what you're getting into if you decide to go that route. And because of all this, the landowners on the Line 61 corridor formed, like I said, the Wisconsin Easement Action Team. So they each pay, we got some grant funding that supported a down payment with the attorney, and then each landowner pays, for this corridor, for the Line 61 corridor, $1,800. And then they have one attorney that's negotiating for all of the landowners. And if you think about it, you have this multi-billion-dollar corporation on one side, or if you team up with all of your, if you have everybody along the line teamed up together, you're balancing out the power a little bit more at the negotiating table. You also, the attorney has a sense of how much Enbridge is offering, so that could help you. If they're trying to lowball you, they do a ton of research to find out. They told one landowner, like, I know you have the kid in school and you're struggling to pay for them. So they do research to know exactly what price what could get you to sell, but they're not going to be able to lowball you if you know what's going on. And then, most importantly, the attorney goes through and makes sure every easement is the same and protects you in every single way possible from all the stuff I talked about. So if you're interested in either learning more about this or learning more about what to consider for easements, we are going to have a much more in-depth, like multi-hour long information meeting with the attorney who will go through some of this stuff to watch for and discuss with you all if you're interested in forming something like we'd love to help with that. And the attorney might be available. He did just have a baby, but I think he's available. So if you're interested in this, there is a sign up at the back, and again, you can see Phyllis or there's one out at the table. Sign up and we'll get in contact with you so we can set up a meeting and talk through this in more detail. Now I just want to talk through eminent domain because I know that's a big concern, and it's the thing that Enbridge threatens at every step of the way. It's sort of what they view as their trump card, and in some ways it can be. So a little history in eminent domain. Eminent domain is in the Constitution, both state Constitution and federal Constitution, in what's called the Takings Clause. And it says that the government can take your land if the original said, I think, for public use with just compensation. So they can take your land if they need to for a public project. Traditionally, eminent domain is used for things like highways or schools. And if you think about sort of a classic scenario, it's used when every single person has signed a contract except one person, and they say, something like a road, you're stopping it and the government takes your land. In 2005, the ability to use eminent domain was pretty drastically expanded in a U.S. Supreme Court case called Kelo versus New London. What happened is the Pfizer Corporation wanted to seize this town, this New London, a neighborhood in New London, Connecticut, to build a headquarters there. And they said, we should get to use eminent domain to do this because we're going to provide this huge public benefit by providing all these jobs. So even though this isn't for a public use, or it's not the government who needs it, and it's not necessarily for a public project, we're going to provide all these public benefits, and unfortunately the U.S. Supreme Court sided with Pfizer and said that's true, you can take this land. And so that opened the door for private companies to have access to eminent domain. Just a very sad anecdote. That green patch right there is, so this is sort of the classic story of Kelo, the pink house. There's a movie called The Little Pink House based on it. It was Suzette Kelo was the one who held out and said, no, I don't, you shouldn't be able to use eminent domain on my house. And she lost, so they tore down her house. They never even built the headquarters. So that's what her house looks like, or where her house looks like today. Yes, I know, very sad. But then here in Wisconsin, so Enbridge still didn't necessarily have the ability to use eminent domain based on some of our laws, but they did in 2015 work behind the scenes to get a law change. It was actually a rider they added into the budget at the very last moment. So it wasn't debated, it wasn't put on, that changed the law that would allow them to sort of expand eligibility so Enbridge can use eminent domain. And open records request, an analysis done by Wisconsin Public Records showed that it was Enbridge behind the move that asked for this. However, that still doesn't mean they can just use it without proving it's necessary. So this is an ongoing thing. A lot of people are watching the U.S. Supreme Court and anticipate that they're going to take up another case that really kind of narrows how broad, when a company, or when you can use eminent domain since it's so broad right now. So this is ongoing, and the Public Service Commission here in Wisconsin is the entity that decides whether or not a pipeline constitutes public use and therefore can be used for eminent domain. So they're not necessarily guaranteed it. There is a big push to change Wisconsin's laws to eliminate eminent domain for oil pipelines. And we do have a petition out there if you want to sign it. And so far, 7 counties in Wisconsin have passed resolutions calling on the legislature to change that law. So getting into, I want to touch on this really briefly, whether it's public use. I know this question has come up, so this is where I just snuck it in. Whether or not Line 5 is necessary and therefore could constitute public use. And so if you haven't seen it, and we do have copies of the fact sheet about this, the National Wildlife Federation hired London Economics, which is like a research facility, to look into whether or not Line 5 is necessary in Michigan. If you're unfamiliar, the Line 5 goes under the Straits of Mackinac, and that is a huge concern for a lot of people in Michigan, and so there's been a huge effort to get the pipeline decommissioned there as well. And so they did this study because a lot of officials in Michigan were saying, we need this pipeline. Enbridge was saying it's necessary for propane in the UP, it's necessary for refineries, so you can't just shut down this pipeline. And this study did find that there are alternatives for all of the things Enbridge claims, and that it could be decommissioned with little to no impact. This study was on Michigan, so on Michigan's economy. I'm guessing it's even smaller impact here in Wisconsin, given the oil just flows through and doesn't go anywhere in Wisconsin. And so, that was mostly on landowners, but for those of you who aren't landowners, as a reminder, these are all the things they're going to need. Every step of the way, Enbridge is going to say, you have to do this, you have to give this stuff, and the only thing that stops them is for us to stand up and say, no, that's not true, that's not the case. A quick example with the Line 61 expansion, which is a pipeline in Wisconsin, and they were increasing the capacity. It goes through Dane County, and Dane County said, hey, this seems really bad because this pipeline's going to be huge. If it ruptures, what if we have to clean it up? We can't afford it. You could destroy a river that the pipeline goes through, or that is downstream of a creek that the pipeline goes through. This is really bad. Without going into the details, they couldn't say you're not allowed to do this, but they said if you do this, you have to buy insurance so that if a spill does happen, you're cleaning it up and we're not on the hook. Every single meeting, every single step in the way, Enbridge sent countless letters that said, this is absolutely illegal, we're going to sue you immediately, we'll bankrupt you in legal fees. And they were wrong, they completely made it up every step of the way. The Dane County Board did a ton of homework and said, no, this isn't true, they require this all over the place. In Washington, this is the norm. They get the Pipeline Safety Trust to come in and say this is absolutely allowed. And Enbridge actually had to go behind the scenes in the state legislature to change the law. So it's no longer allowed in specific cases, but they just completely lied to the county board and said you can't do this, and they were completely wrong. So they're going to do this over and over again, but what we can do is team up together, and so attend meetings like this. I'm thankful you're all here. Speak out at every single step of the process, so they're going to need a ton of permits, so you can show up at every single one of those hearings and talk about why this pipeline needs to be decommissioned. When you do that, not only does the person offering the permit hear you, but investors hear you. I know that was pretty key in stopping the GTAC, was when people said this is a bad investment, we're walking away. Investors hear you, other state agencies hear you. The state of Michigan hears you, so as they're putting pressure on Enbridge, we can be putting pressure on here. As Chairman Wiggins said, make your opposition known, talk to your neighbors, use social media, letters to the editor, so people know this is happening and know that it's not okay, and band together. So that's all I have.
So along the lines of getting legal representation, the sign-up sheet is right outside on the table. One of the things that we are prepared to do in Bad River is we're going to work proactively to create that vehicle. And that notion of banding together for all of you that might be private property owners, or if you know private property owners in the path of Enbridge, we want to get kind of the one-stop shop legal representation for our watershed neighbors. So when Enbridge comes calling, you can all flash essentially the same card and send them into the brick wall, so to speak. I would highly encourage you to drop notions of negotiation or holding out for money. I want to underscore the importance of why we're here tonight, and I don't want to lose that. It's to reject and say, get out to Enbridge, right? Yeah, so make sure that even if you're going to be advocating later on for somebody that you know, make sure that you sign up, and we're gonna work to put that vehicle together. We have as a sovereign nation, we have very high-powered friends, environmental advocacy groups, and other folks that are always interested in standing up for water, just like we do, and just like you do. And so we want to make some of these connections. And in order to do that, we need to know who you are and how to contact you.